Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to today's Heritage Lunch and Learn on the rehabilitation of Yaletown Square or the MacPherson Teetzel Company Building. For those of you I haven't had the pleasure of meeting, my name is Sarah Carlson, and I am the Director of Education at Vancouver Heritage Foundation. And I have the pleasure of being joined today by Derek Fleming. And we're really delighted to have you here with us this afternoon. So before we get started with our virtual event this afternoon, I'd just like to take a moment to recognize the diverse history and cultural heritage of Vancouver, and that the city, as it is known today, is located on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples. We ask that you, for wherever you're joining us from today, that you reflect on the knowledge of and relationship you have with those people whose lands you may occupy. So the area that we'll be exploring in this talk today, known as Yaletown, is one of the neighborhoods that shares the border with False Creek. Archaeological evidence and oral traditions record the First Nations use of False Creek in the area for over 3,000 years. Prior to the arrival of the first colonial settlers in the Burrard Inlet in the late 1850s, False Creek was 5 times the present size and included a large tidal mudflat. This ecologically rich site was blanketed with thick eelgrass, plentiful clam beds, and countless songbirds. As urbanization grew with the arrival of the CPR Railway in 1887, the Musqueam and Squamish people who hunted and fished these lands for millennium were moved to reserves in less desirable areas of Vancouver. So while the talk is not focusing on this part of Yaletown's history today, I'd really encourage you to visit the websites of the First Nations in your community, as well as the First Peoples Map of BC, to learn more about the long history of Indigenous peoples on this land. So just a little bit about VHF before we get started. So for those of you who don't know us, Vancouver Heritage Foundation is a registered charity, and our goal is to raise the awareness of the vital contribution that heritage makes to a vibrant, inclusive, and sustainable community. We advance the appreciation and conservation of our city's diverse heritage places and their stories through our educational programming, like this Heritage Lunch and Learn, also through our special projects, informational resources, and grants. This Heritage Lunch and Learn series is something that we've offered virtually for 3 years now. They feature current heritage projects and topics, and we're really excited to have Derek here to share with you this wonderful conservation project in Yaletown. So this talk is the first of our fall season. So if you're curious about the other 2 that will take place in October and November, you can have a look at our website and feel welcome to sign up for those as well. So we're really grateful to have Derek here to share his experience and insights with us this afternoon on the MacPherson Teetzel Company Building rehabilitation. So I'm just going to introduce him and then pass things over to him. So Derek Fleming is an associate principal at Acton Ostry Architects with a professional registration in British Columbia. He has been a member of the Royal Architectural Institute of Canada since 2009. Derek has over 20 years of experience leading residential, commercial, and public institutional projects from pre-design through construction completion, and served as the project lead for the Yaletown Square project. So thanks so much for being here, Derek, and over to you.
Great, thank you, Sarah. Thanks for inviting us and for giving us this opportunity to talk about and to show you the journey that was the rehabilitation and restoration of the MacPherson Teetzel Company Building over what was about a 4-year time span. So my main objective today is a simple one. I'm going to kind of tell you the story of the project sort of from start to finish, and I think the process and the finished product will kind of speak for itself. So I'm going to walk you through some background info to provide some context to what you'll see and take you through some of the details and the explorations that were part of our process. But really, I think the biggest focus will be on the construction, because I think that's where it gets especially interesting. Heritage restoration projects are not your typical projects. First of all, they're kind of few and far between, and nothing is really straightforward, or even like straight for that matter. When you're dealing with a 110-year-old structure, there's generally a lack of documentation. You're dealing with concealed conditions. The building is built to a completely different set of standards, and so you kind of have to adjust the way of thinking about design in order to respond to these conditions and to be sensitive to them, and to try and, on the one hand, you're trying to preempt certain things that you suspect might arise based on experience, but also remain flexible in your thinking and your process, and you're trying to design that flexibility into the project right from day one. I could talk for a long time about this project. I'm going to try and keep it relatively brief. I understand I have about 40 minutes, and then that should be time for questions and answers. I want to acknowledge the project team. We had a wealth of consultant expertise on the project from a range of disciplines, which you see here. And I also want to acknowledge the construction team, which was led by the Habler Group, who, collectively, the construction team, the consultant team did an amazing job on this project, bringing it to fruition. First, I'll provide a bit of context. I'll start with this picture of the completed project, and we're going to kind of wind the clock back to the beginning. At a high level, the goals of the project at the outset were to preserve and restore the historic building to resemble its appearance when it was originally constructed, to upgrade the structure, the services, the accessibility, to increase the building's functionality and for adaptive reuse as commercial and office space, to preserve the existing character-defining elements and to reinstate missing and deteriorated ones. We had to seismically upgrade the existing building to be in compliance with the current building bylaw. Of course, the addition of 3 new levels of office space above, which would provide the on-site density necessary to achieve the conservation goals of the project. And then finally, to recognize and legally protect the rehabilitated building with a bylaw designating it as protected heritage property in the city of Vancouver. So the owner purchased the building in 2016, seeing the potential to revive the historic, the character. He approached Acton Ostry the following year, looking for a solution that would conserve the building on the site while improving its functionality and realizing the development potential afforded under the current zoning bylaw. At the time we were engaged on the project, it was known as Yaletown Square. You can see there in the sign above the side entry. The warehouse was originally designed by the architectural firm Parr Fee, and in 1910, when it was constructed, it was named the MacPherson Teetzel Company Building, which was the first tenant of the building. They were hardware distributors. And then the building housed various manufacturing and industrial companies for the first half of the last century. And then in late 1970s, it was renovated for contemporary uses. And these renovations saw the removal of many significant character-defining elements from the original historic building, such as the Homer Street storefront and the prominent overhanging cornice there on Homer Street, wrapping around to Drake Street. And certain interventions in particular, like the rebuilt and reconfigured entrance and breezeway, the new sunken side entrance from Drake Street, the two-story atrium that was carved into the middle of the building. These were carried out in a manner somewhat unsympathetic to the historic building. Although it was not legally protected when we began work on the project, it was listed on the Vancouver Heritage Register, identified as having historical significance. The city of Vancouver valued as a good example of an early Yaletown warehouse and the Edwardian architecture of that time. The Yaletown neighbourhood, of course, this is the site located at the south end, close to Davidland Park. It's an aerial view of Yaletown from 1946, and that is our building there, the MacPherson Teetzel Building. This area, of course, was the terminus for the CP Railway and was developed in the early 1900s as an industrial warehouse district. But then with the advent of truck and trailer transportation from about the 30s onward, Yaletown deteriorated as the industry vacated the area in favor of suburban locations. Now, this is the same view present day. I was kind of like doing the flip between the two and seeing how Yaletown was built up, because in the 80s it experienced a real wave of development and revitalization. Many of the historic buildings were adapted for reuse, and we had these dense blocks of low to mid-rise buildings, adapted historic buildings mixed with new infill developments, and then high-rise buildings sort of interspersed throughout the neighborhood occasionally, but especially concentrated around the edge. Our site at 1290 Homer Street, it's rectangular inside. It was roughly 560 square meters, 6,000 square feet, and slopes down almost a full story from Homer Street down to Hamilton Street. And on the Hamilton Street side is, of course, the Yaletown dock, which you can see here in the photos to the right, which is the elevated platform, which was formerly served to load and unload goods transported by rail, but is now a pedestrian promenade, patios, etc. So a bit of context, this is the streetscape on the Homer Street side at the top, Hamilton Street side at the bottom, so that you can see that the site is at the end of the block, which consisted mainly of 4 to 6 story buildings. About 60% of those buildings were from the first half of the 20th century. And had over the last 50, 60 years undergone a variety of restorations and renovations, and then the remainder were newer infill developments. So at 2 stories high facing Homer Street, This site, this building was the lowest on the block and something of an anomaly in the otherwise fairly consistent street wall. Starting off the project, we doing some archival research, looking for documents, photographs of the old building. We were able to find very limited archival photos, but you can see here a photo from about 1935 on the left-hand side. This is a good image from the Homer and Drake side. And then an older photo in the middle from the Hamilton Street side. You can see there the Yaletown dock as a wood dock and a big overhanging canopy over the area just behind our building there. And then the photo on the right from about the same time frame as the one on the left, where the dock has been reconstructed as a concrete structure, and we have trucks loading and unloading. Another aerial view, and there you can see the site highlighted. And thought that this was an interesting one. This was found this flyer, this advertisement from 1911. So it was after the building was started, but before it was completed. And the image actually shows the building with a third story on it. So of course that third story was never built. We don't know why. Then we have some pictures from the 70s, late 70s, I guess, based on the fact that the renovations are already complete, and based on the cars, of course, and then just kind of looking at how the neighborhood is built up. This is the site in 2017 when we began work on the project. From the late 70s, again, from the Hamilton and Drake Street side. And you can see how that elevated Yaletown dock actually wrapped around the corner from Hamilton and up Drake. And somebody has parked their AMC Gremlin up there for everyone to admire. Flipping to the next photo, you can see how the Drake Street and the sidewalk were raised up at some point, which made the raised dock a feature only on the Hamilton Street side. Also note in this photo that red paint on the Hamilton Street side of the building, which is actually a thick layer of parging over the brick. So we didn't really know what we were going to find underneath that when we began work on it. So I'll take you through some of the design rationale, some of the background. Despite those previous rehabilitations that I spoke about, the building, as we took it on in 2017, maintained the integrity of its overall form, its scale and massing. It's a two-story building on Homer, nearly 3 stories facing Hamilton, with a simple rectangular plan, low slope roof, and the 3 facades are generally quite plain and unadorned, without ornament. There's a repetitive pattern of punched window openings. And then we have these strong horizontal bands of parged concrete, which delineate the floor levels of the building. The original wood sash, somewhat unique center pivot windows were remaining for the most part, in place and intact. At least we thought at the time. More on that later. And then we have these load-bearing brick masonry walls, which are more than 2 feet thick, and which sat atop a concrete foundation, and together with a heavy timber post and beam structure of the interior, supported solid timber floors throughout the building. One of the first steps was to have the heritage consultant prepare a conservation plan for the project. And in addition to providing historical background and the statement of significance for the building, this plan would in many ways be the governing document, kind of the roadmap for the conservation work to be undertaken over the course of the project. And in addition to the conservation plan, the project was designed in accordance with a number of other policies and guidelines. Critical among these is the Parks Canada standards and guidelines for the conservation of historic places in Canada. So as mentioned, the conservation plan laid out strategies and requirements for the preservation, rehabilitation, and restoration of various parts of the building. And the significant interventions being proposed were the preservation of that original exterior masonry and the window assemblies to restore the missing projecting cornice on Homer Street, and to rehabilitate the interior spaces and do seismic upgrading of the existing historic structure, to restore the missing storefront on Homer as well. And then, of course, the construction of the 3-story addition above to accommodate new office space. The requirements of the conservation plan were laid out in detail in the construction documents for the project, further supplemented by additional site investigations and existing condition photos, and etc. As part of the regulatory and approvals process, the project was presented to the Vancouver Heritage Commission, where it received unanimous support. It was also presented to the Urban Design Panel. And then at the same time that we were developing the conservation strategies for the historic building, we began to look at what the new addition might be and how it might interface with the existing building. So these are a series of diagrams, sort of translating those conservation plan items onto the existing building plans and elevations, highlighting the measures for rehabilitation and restoration, removal, etc. So we quickly tested massing options for the vertical addition to investigate the appropriate response to the existing building with that addition. As with the approach to the conservation work, the new addition had to be designed in accordance with the Parks Canada standards and guidelines to conserve the heritage value and the character defining elements of the historic place, and to be physically and visually compatible with, but distinguishable from, the historic building. The existing building is a simple, modest, rectangular form, and the new addition was essentially an extrusion of that. So the block form of the building was maintained by the addition, as was its relationship to the lot lines in all levels. And we have this recessed connecting floor, which would serve to preserve the integrity of the existing roof line and the reinstated cornice, allowing the heritage building to express its essential form and character clearly. So the addition would have the appearance of a simple, contemporary, two-story volume resting atop the historic building. We studied a myriad of facade options and determined that the one on the right was the most appropriate. So we see the new structure spanning that gap between the addition and the historic building, extending out of that building, drawing a connection between the new columns and the brick piers between the windows below. And we have this continuous ribbon windows of the addition, which reference the strong horizontality of the existing building, but without mimicking or competing with that rhythm of the punched openings below. In terms of the urban response of the new addition, we're just returning to this slide briefly showing the urban context. We looked at how the proposal fits in. So we noted that the development brings the overall height and massing for the site in line with the buildings along this block of Homer Street. It maintains that sawtooth character you see there with the street wall, consistent with the condition of these kind of offset windows and floor levels between buildings, complementary to the overall color palette of buildings in the area. Would firmly anchor the end of the block, improve the public realm adjacent to the site, and on the whole just fit, we felt quite seamlessly into the fabric of the neighborhood. And further investigation studying the massing and the architectural expression within the building's context through a series of montages and view studies. We had a 3D model of the proposal built. This was ultimately presented to the urban design panel as well. And, in keeping with the standards and guidelines, you can see that the addition clearly draws a distinction between the historic and the new. And, the materials and the massing, everything being considered at this time was to be compatible with the exterior form of the historic building and its setting. I've mostly been discussing the exterior of the building to this point, just to give you a quick understanding of the inside. I'll run through the floor plan. So here we have the bottom level. This is kind of a partial basement level. It's buried at the Homer Street side and mostly above grade at Hamilton. It's mostly a commercial unit. There's bike storage and end of trip facilities, waste and recycling room with a dock leveler to bring the bins up to the level of the Yaletown dock. And then, of course, the new core, which introduced 2 exit stairs to be code compliant and 2 elevators for improved circulation and accessibility. The second level, which is the level accessed off of Homer Street, is the larger commercial unit. There's a separate entrance for the office spaces on levels 3 to 6 above and the roof deck. And also just maybe worth noting that the building was designed with the infrastructure for a kitchen exhaust system in case there could be a restaurant tenant on the lower level and on this floor. Then that system would be in place to allow that to happen. Level 3, which is the top floor of the existing historic building, you can see the heavy timber column grid. It's the first level of open office space. And then we get above that, so level 4, which is the roof of the old building, has the inset glazing that wraps all the way around in this full perimeter wraparound terrace created by that inset. Level 5, open office space. There's no structure in the middle. It's a clear span right across the space. Level 6, open office space as well. And then the rooftop with a generous rooftop patio, which has amazing views to the south towards False Creek and Davidland Park, and it's surrounded by an extensive green roof, which is also a green roof on top of this interior space there as well. Building sections just show the new addition above the existing, and the basement level was excavated down over 2 feet below the existing level. As you can note here, these massive new foundations and the additional excavation depth required for that to happen. And then we had to extend the heavy timber columns at the basement as well. That was just to gain more headroom, make the space more functional. And then cross sections, the one on the right being the one with the elevator and stair core. And again, you see that massive below grade structure. This is due to the fact that the core is offset. It's not central to the building. It's off on one side. So the entire building, including the historic building, is relying upon that for lateral support for seismic. So it needed this massive raft slab foundation in order to provide the necessary stability. The project undertook a number of public realm improvements as well to the Yaletown dock adjacent to the building, which included replacing the existing stairwells, regrading the surface to correct drainage deficiencies, resurfacing the dock as it was, a real mess with bits of asphalt and patchwork, resurfacing it with new pavers, installing new pipe rail along the edge where it was previously missing, putting in a new code compliant accessible ramp at the southeast corner, and then creating a space that would enable a potential sidewalk patio, depending on the tenant, which would provide great animation to that corner. And then the waste and recycling functions of the building were brought inside to that waste and recycling room that I showed you a few moments ago, which would just reduce the reliance on these kind of unsightly dumpsters that line the town streets. So the long-term objective is, as buildings get renovated and or new buildings go up, that they move those functions inside, and one day those dumpsters can be removed. New landscaping on the dock included, drought-resistant evergreen species, and then of course there was the extensive green roof that I mentioned, which was a pre-grown vegetation mat system, so that it would be hardy and low maintenance right from the start. Just want to briefly talk about sustainability. It's not at the forefront of everyone's mind when thinking about the key tenets of sustainable design, but heritage conservation is inherently sustainable. Adaptive reuse of the existing building conserves material resources, retains cultural resources, reduces waste, and minimizes the environmental impact of development. But the approach must prioritize measures that optimize performance while maintaining the heritage value. It really necessitates a slightly different way of thinking about it, because improvements to the envelope and to the ventilation of the historic building have to respect its breathability, which for more than a century has ensured passive air changes and drying of materials through respiration. So, we need to take look at strategies to reduce air leakage and improve thermal performance and reduce moisture ingress, et cetera, that wouldn't have unintended negative consequences on the existing assemblies and building components. And then, of course, other measures undertaken for the project, like conserving water with low-flow fixtures and the green roof for increased urban biodiversity. And the project supports sustainable transportation. There's no parking on site, and we have an extra large bike storage room with additional end of trip facilities. And of course, the new addition has high performance building envelopes and systems. So by this point, the strategies around the heritage conservation were essentially established. The building plans were kind of worked out or resolving, and the massing and the architectural expression of the vertical addition were being resolved. But so we turned our attention focused to the exact nature of the cladding material for the addition. So the recessed connecting level above the roofline of the historic building would feature floor to ceiling glazing, and the two-story volume above would be clad with a panel system. And we wanted that to be a distinctly modern construction material, so that it would distinguish itself from the historic masonry, and be, have a lighter appearance, smoother finish, simpler articulation. We settled on a concrete panel material and then searched for colors that would have a similar value to that of the historic brick masonry. We wanted it to be complementary, but not identical. It wasn't to compete for visual interest with the heavy and highly textured and variegated brick masonry of the historic building. We had the advantage here of having full access to the existing building. So what better way to test materials than to construct large-scale mock-ups of materials on site? So that's what we did. And we had these erected on the roof of the building, and they were left up there for several days. We could view them from different angles, take a look at different times of day, different weather conditions, et cetera, and ultimately find the material that we felt was the right fit. This slide shows the final selection of the cladding material. It's these two panels at the top, and then along with the various other materials chosen for the project, you can start to see how it all kind of comes together as a whole. We liked the texture and the material qualities of this panel. The natural material has subtle variations in it at a larger scale. It reflects the light differently depending on how it's viewed, and it responds to the natural environment, rain and sun, etc., which is unlike many other modern cladding materials that are more like plastic or metal based. And then, we had those two panels. It was subtle difference in color. And we started studying the patternings. The intent was to develop a scheme that could be repeated for ease of installation on site, but without that repetition being apparent. And in this exercise, we're kind of enhancing the difference between the panels a little bit so that we could see it. But we actually printed these out like full-scale mock-ups, 4 feet high bands, and had them mounted in the taking over a big part of the office, and had them up on the walls where we could stand back and look at them and evaluate them, and ultimately select what we felt was the best one. So this is that final cladding material pattern. Again, the difference is slightly enhanced, and on the building elevations and with the final glazing configuration, etc. So I'm going to take you through just a glimpse of some of the aspects of the design and coordination work to get us to the point that you just saw. So kind of parallels in terms of timeline, the last section, but delves into a bit of the detail of the behind the scenes work. So, it started with all the consultants carrying out their own investigations and assessments of the existing historic building. Here are structural heavy timber framing diagrams and notes. We had a dialogue right off the bat with the structural engineer, what the overall high-level structural strategy is for building the new vertical addition above, and how that would interface with the existing building and help to seismically upgrade it. So we proposed a number of schemes, which became the basis for back and forth with the engineer, looking at various options. The end result was kind of a hybrid, similar to what you see on the right-hand side, option 4, but without CLT at the transfer level. That was done with steel beams instead. And then that new vertical structures threaded down through the existing building and serves not only to support the new addition, but to stabilize the existing heavy timber structure and the load-bearing masonry walls. And then once we had that kind of rough scheme, we investigated various options for how that new vertical structure would interface with those load-bearing masonry walls. So testing out different ideas for steel column profiles, concrete columns, composite steel and concrete solutions, and eventually settling on the one highlighted here at the top left, as it would have the least impact on the space and the functionality of the existing buildings, and protrude out into the space. And also as a composite, so you have the steel I-beam column section, and that's filled with concrete behind it. So that allows the steel and concrete to work together and maximizes direct contact with the masonry around it in order to stabilize the brick masonry. Further development of the structural system, including some of the details for how to accommodate the offsets at level 4, then developing the scheme for the lowering of the basement slab and underpinning the existing concrete wall. So we have the addition of a new 6-inch thick reinforced concrete wall over the entire face of the existing foundation. And then we're extending those heavy timber columns down vertically. We have that massive raft slab under the core, which I mentioned earlier. And then we have this little note here on this sketch: existing spread footings demolished and removed if existent. And it's just one thing to note with this building, we didn't, again, coming back to that earlier point, we didn't quite know what to expect. Very little documentation on how the building was built. We did have a geoscan come in and scan for footings and rebar and stuff like that, but it's it's kind of a rough exercise and gives you maybe a bit of a sense or an approximation of what's there, but nothing is guaranteed. Nothing's known until you start to get in there and take things apart. Developing the connection details for those heavy timber column extensions of the basement, working with the structural engineer back and forth to develop various unique detail conditions around the building, especially at the interface between the new structure and the old. There were very few archival photographs with which to work to see how the missing cornice and storefront would have looked. So we had to study what we had carefully, scale things based on known components like brick where possible. We dialogued with the heritage consultant, of course, and local metal trades even, specializing in this sort of work to determine the likely configuration for these components. In a similar way, we studied the storefront, consulted with heritage woodworkers, and then we had to, kind of adapt that to suit that second entry and the need to inset the doors so that they could swing out without going over the sidewalk in accordance with modern building code requirements. And then those studies get develop into the details for the project. And as you can see here, including like a structural framing study model. Before we get into the construction photos, just a quick but slightly more in-depth look at the existing conditions of the building. So here again, as I mentioned, you note that red parging, that stucco on the east side. We have evidence of moisture issues, brick deterioration, serious brick deterioration. The building it looked like it had been probably sandblasted in the past, which is exactly the wrong thing to do with brick. It removes the fire skin from the surface of the brick and just leaves it open to moisture and accelerates the deterioration dramatically. So there was that to deal with. And then we had those renos and interventions from the 70s. In the interior space, as I mentioned earlier, that atrium that was cut up through the middle with the skylight above, the spiral stair, and then the interior space was largely partitioned into various compartments, and then the solid timber floors covered over with drywall between the heavy timber beams. Photos of the basement and the stair core. It's worth noting there was no elevator in this building actually, and there was only one exit stair, non-code compliant. So there were obviously some things that needed to be addressed. And then there were just years of ad hoc services, piping, conduit, cables, etc., kind of running everywhere, often just cut or cored through, heavy timber beams or columns and whatnot. So these all had to be, everything had to be removed, and then the damage kind of assessed. So work got underway on the project at the start of October 2019. This is a little less than 2 years after we got started on the project. Here you can see the site trailer going up, hoarding, tree protection. It's worth saying that this was not an easy site construction-wise. There's no on-site space for construction staging, very challenging in terms of access for machinery and equipment and deliveries, construction waste, etc. But by the second week of October, most of the interior finishes, partitions, etc., were gone. We had some interesting found objects from the demolition. These were mostly discovered in like cavities behind the brick, like cavities in the brick wall. This one is especially kind of fun. This is medicinal purposes only. There's that bottle of Guinness. Anyways, it's always interesting to find some stuff like this. And then now with everything removed, we could see the conditions of the existing structure as we get in there. All the existing like checks and cracks had to be analyzed for structural impact and also for the char rating of the heavy timbers that would affect its fire resistance rating. We had the opportunity to get in and measure all the parts that were inaccessible before with our tape measures, or if you forget your tape, then with a pack of gum. Here you can see the removal of the existing core, the concrete block stair core, and the exposure of that load-bearing brick wall on the north side, right next to the neighbor's building. So that wall had to come down and to make way for the new concrete core. And as they started to remove it, you can see here in this photo on the right, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 layers of brick. And they got to this last layer and realized that like the bricks would not come off. What we realized was that although documents we'd seen indicated that the neighboring building was built at the same time, it seemed that this building was actually built first, and the neighboring building, which is a concrete structure, was poured directly up against it. So it was fully bonded to the brick. So there was no way that last layer of brick was coming off. So here we are, the first month of construction, and we're already kind of discovering some surprises, having to quickly modify the drawings and the details to accommodate this extra layer that would have to remain in place in the gap between the buildings. All those bricks that were removed from that wall were retained and sorted and cleaned for future use in the brickwork. Here on the left-hand side, you see that north wall removal going down to the first floor. That's as far back as they could get the brick. You see the heavy timber beams that had to come out were all being tagged and indexed so that they could be put back in place. And then on the right-hand side, that brick, as I mentioned, is all being sorted and stacked on pallets and wrapped, and that was removed and stored off-site. By December 2019, the old building core was removed all the way down to the basement, and they were starting work on excavation of the basement core slab. And here, on the left-hand side, you can see the concrete foundation wall scraped down. Again, could not be completely removed because it was just attached to the neighboring building. So it's sheared down as much as possible. And then they're getting going on the excavation in the basement. And very limited headroom, very tight space. Couldn't get in there with big equipment. So it was all done with these little bobcats and mini excavators. And quite frankly, a lot of it by hand, by shovel and wheelbarrow. You know, being December and January, we're fully into the rainy season. And this was just one of the wettest periods, I think, far more rain than average, including an extended cold snap that actually froze a lot of the mud, and so made working conditions down there quite difficult. Meanwhile, sort of up in the upper parts of the building, the masonry contractors were starting to cut those slots into the existing brick piers to make way for the new steel structure. And an extensive engineered temporary shoring system was going up through all levels to basically support the building while the entire bottom was dug out from underneath it. So you can see there on the right, this is one of the heavy timber columns from the basement level, which is hanging suspended from the floor above, and it's been excavated down probably nearly 6 feet already below that point, and it's going to go even deeper. They begin work on the underpinning of the existing foundation walls. So they do this in sections, providing the new deeper foundations, and then the shoring below the neighboring building to the north. So by March, this is what the building was looking like. The crane base is starting to go in, the entire roof is removed. And then this happens. COVID, of course, affected everybody, and had a great impact across all industries, and the construction industry was no different. They had to adapt, new health and safety measures, of course, and distancing, and completely rethink kind of the way they would carry out construction on the site, because you can't have big crews of people working closely together. So Habler had to quickly adapt and create a new plan for that and keep going, which they did. This is a diagram of that big raft slab that I showed earlier. The 6 foot thick concrete, these grade beams coming out to a grade beam supported on micropiles. And I'll show you this just because you can see in this next slide as they're starting to form that raft slab down at the bottom. So this will be the big 6 foot thick pad. These are the grade beams there that will extend out to the long grade beam running this way, which is supported on micropiles, and then of course will carry the load of the historic building. And then after that's poured, the infill goes back in. You can see the extension of those heavy timber columns, waterproofing along the neighboring building, and the construction of the new core starting. Around about this time, further investigation into the condition of the existing windows showed that most were in fact, unfortunately, just too rotten to salvage. They were concealed and essentially held together with multiple layers of paint, but there was just far too much rot. So we had to engage with Heritage Window woodworking company, who came in and measured everything and took samples and studied the existing windows, and they would create new windows, center pivot using similar or even reusing some of the existing hardware where possible. Here we have the first mock-ups of the brick repointing starting. By June 2020, there's the new concrete wall going up next to the neighboring building and the core. We have the detail for those heavy timber column extensions at the basement, and that's the new 6-inch thick concrete wall being poured over applied over the existing foundation wall. And here you see the rebar cages going into those slots in the brick. So as I mentioned earlier, this is a composite steel and concrete column solution. So the steel column would go in front of this, be filled with concrete, and then all of these pins, which are epoxied into the brick, also get embedded into the concrete, and that reinforces and stabilizes the historic brick. So brick cleaning, repointing, crack repair underway throughout that summer. The building was wrapped to facilitate that. Here you can see the concrete core and north wall proceeding up above the neighboring building. And then in September that year, the first of the new steel columns are going in. So these were threaded down from above, all the way down from the top of the building down to the new foundation. And then the heavy timber beams could be reinstated, supported on these brackets. These pins, again, which is bonds it all to the concrete that would then get poured behind it. New brackets connecting the heavy timber to the concrete core. And then here in October, the core of the north wall is completed. And so you see the steel composite columns are basically complete up to the top of the existing building, and the heavy timber beams are being reinstated. Then in October, the new steel at the roof of the old building, so this is the new level 4, starting to arrive, and those are going above the existing heavy timber beams at that level. Brick repointing, long process to continuing around the building. Here the mason, you can see, is removing individual bricks that were too damaged to salvage, replacing those with bricks that were salvaged from the demolition of the north wall. It's all the joints are being scraped out and repointed. And then the steel structure, once it gets going, goes up quite quickly. And here we have the open web steel joists for levels 5 and 6. And by January, roughly 2 months after it started, the steel erection is essentially complete. And we have here the structure for the overhanging cornice showing up on site, as well as metal work underway for the restoration and reinstatement of some of the missing. This is the secondary cornice at the top of the lintel band near the parapet. Preparation for the installation of the new wood windows. We also did mock-ups testing different bead blasting pressures for the heavy timber. So the intent was to go in and blast all the heavy timber to clean off a lot of the remaining bits from the interior partitions and stuff. There's paint and sealant and all kinds of things that just couldn't be removed effectively manually. So testing out different pressures, the goal being to find just the right amount. You don't want to blast it until it looks like brand new wood. It's just the intent is to get it clean and still maintain that kind of patina. Status in February of 2021. You can see the structures up to the roof level. You can see there that roof deck, and framing is underway for the envelope installation of the new building. The construction of the overhanging cornice, so you can see that structure, and then the prefabricated metal starting to show up on site. Wood window installation, these are the new windows going in throughout February and March. And then here's a before and after image of that, the bead blasting on the heavy timber, also cleaning up a number of those steel connections. Here's ongoing work with the construction of the cornice, both the lower one on top of the lintel band and the significant overhanging cornice in Homer and Drake. And starting work on the historic storefront. Also, the heavy timber is all wrapped and protected while the steel structure gets fire sprayed. You can see here there are actually connections from those new steel beams down to the top of the heavy timber columns. They're not load bearing per se, but the existing heavy timber structure was used as part of the deflection management of the new structure. Ongoing work of the storefront and the new steel being fire protected. For these elements, because they're to be left exposed and they're quite prominent, we're using an intumescent fire spray, fire paint that has to go on, and it goes on quite thick in several layers. And then in May of 2021, the first bit of the panel cladding begins to get installed. So ongoing storefront work by the Heritage Woodworker. And 2 months after the start of the cladding install, it's mostly complete. So the masons now are removing a lot of the scaffolding around the building. We're starting to get a real first sense of what, the relationship with the addition to the historic building and what the whole thing is going to look like. Throughout July, ongoing work on the cornice. You can see the scaffolding being further removed, glazing installation on the new addition. Some cladding install still happening. Storefront, the historic storefront construction is mostly complete. And now they're able to remove a lot of the staging that they had on the Yaletown dockside and really get started over there in earnest. So throughout that summer and into fall, they're working on the interior finishing of the new addition. This is level 4, where we have the inset level, where we have the continuous wraparound terrace. These large sliding doors that go all the way around the perimeter for access and for natural ventilation. And then in the historic building, continuing with the fire protection of the columns and general cleanup and finishing up the brick repointing, etc. So here we are in August. You can see those newly installed heritage windows, the center pivot, looking up at the cornice, which is now essentially complete, just waiting for its paint, and the storefront. This was testing out lighting mock-up at night for integrating a linear light at the top of this cornice to illuminate the underside of the overhanging cornice. And then as we're getting into September, this is the application of the final paint finish on those steel columns, getting close to what the shell would eventually look like. And we're continuing on the roof deck, as well as the Yaletown dock. And the exposed foundation walls all around the building where there was a lot of work to repair cracks, fill honeycombing, etc. But you'll notice that they were not filled in parge. The intent was to never make them smooth. We didn't want to make them look new. Again, we're still maintaining that historic character, and some of that roughness and imperfection is an important part of that. So by November, the storefront has got its paint, maybe not the final coat, but again, these colors, the kind of off-white color of the windows and the cornice, as well as the color of the storefront, these are colors from the kind of the approved and sort of limited range of the Vancouver heritage paint colors, and were determined by the heritage consultant to be most likely colors that were used at the time. And again, you can see with this cornice above the storefront, this is the original cornice, retained as much as possible. Only parts that were just too corroded were replaced, but generally it was all left kind of cleaned up and repainted. The intent being to restore as much of the original heritage elements as possible. So completion of the Yaletown dock, public realm work by the end of the year, and then finishing up with some of the interior work. And here we have the entry to the office space and the elevator lobby, which was designed to be distinctly kind of modern insertion into the existing building. And then I thought I would run through just some final photos of completion. We had the building photographed in spring of 2022. So I'll just flip through these and let you have a look, and then we can have a little bit of time for questions. Well, thank you very much. I hope you enjoyed the talk and learned some things about the project. Sarah, I guess I'll turn it back over to you. And if there are any questions, I'd be happy to do my best to answer them.
Fantastic. Yeah, thanks so much for that, Derek. That was a fascinating look into the process of what it looks like behind the scenes. I don't think I've ever seen a presentation that's gone so in depth, which I so appreciate. And like the documentation photos are so interesting about like how all the design choices are informed by like the difference and the melding of two buildings. If anyone has any questions, please put those in the chat. I'd be happy to put those out. Was this your first heritage project that you were working on, Derek?
For me personally, it was. The office has done quite a bit of heritage work in the past, mostly in Gastown, with the Alhambra, Flak Block, Courtage and Garage, number of buildings down there that we did kind of in the early 2000s, or maybe completing around 2009, thereabouts. But personally, for me, this was the first project of this nature, and it was very interesting. As I said back at the beginning, you really have to adjust your way of thinking. It's a very different process, full of challenges, but that's what makes it fun, keeps it interesting.
Absolutely. Well, and what a fantastic example of that, of pivoting when you do come up across some of those unexpected challenges when you're getting to kind of know what the building is. Because like you said, you can't really know until you get in there and actually see what is there. I think you were so thorough that everyone was just like, wow, fantastic. Thoughtful and beautifully detailed. That was one of the comments that came in. So thanks again for that. Well, if no one is wondering anything else, I'll just again say a big thank you to Derek for making himself available to share the hard work of all the different people that worked on this project. You saw at the beginning that it takes a village in terms of the construction and the heritage consultant architects. It's, everyone does their job all together, and to get a project done through COVID is just a wonderful achievement. So we're happy to have Yaletown Square restored and on the street corner again. Thanks to everyone for joining us this afternoon. I hope it's piqued your interest in kind of what's going on in terms of the Yaletown neighborhood, as well as other areas of Vancouver, other projects that might be going on. If you're curious about Vancouver's history, we do have some resources that will be helpful in your search. The Heritage Site Finder has all of the heritage sites that are on the Vancouver Heritage Register in an illustrated kind of interactive way. Derek mentioned that one of the goals of this project was to designate it. So that is fantastic that it's now a designated site on the Heritage Register. So if you're curious, you can go and see that. Places That Matter is also another one of our big initiatives. So it's a community history resource. So those are community nominated sites of importance. So that's all available on our website. Just a few notes about some upcoming events that might be of interest. We have our fall fundraising gala at Cecil Green Park House at UBC. That's on Thursday, September 28th. And then our next Lunch and Learn talk will be taking place on Thursday at noon again on October 19th. And we're really excited to be able to feature another fantastic project. This one's one of the most ambitious heritage redevelopment projects in Canada's history. So we're featuring the Post. So we're going to have one of the architects and the heritage consultant, as well as one of the developers chatting with us then. So if you want to stay up to date with our news and events, sign up for our emails or follow us on social media. But yes, thank you, Derek. Thanks everyone for joining us, and see you again soon. Have a wonderful rest of your day.
All right, you too. Thanks, everyone. Thank you, Sarah.
Bye.